Alrighty, lads, we are back. This time we are discussing what is the Navigator Nobilite. So first off, we're going to talk about the Navigators. Then in this video, we're going to talk about the perception of a Navigator. Then we're going to talk about the noble houses. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the culture of the Navigator Nobilite. If you like this new video format, please let me know. It's a lot more organized and visually it's much more dynamic. So first off, let's talk about what is a Navigator, what makes them so special, what makes them unique, how do you even become a Navigator? So first off, first things first, it's a genetic thing. To be a Navigator is to be a non-human, a abhuman, as they're slated and labeled in the Imperium. One of the interesting things about this, though, is that in order to be a Navigator, you have to have a specific gene called the Navigator gene. And the Navigator gene is actually considered recessive. So in other words, if a Navigator has sex with a regular human, the child will never, ever, ever be a Navigator because that human gene will overpower it. Likewise, when it comes to the Navigators breeding with any other Navigator, they also look for genetic matching. Because the issue here is that Navigators have mutations. It's not uncommon for a Navigator to have many mutations. Scaly skin, a weird chiseled jawline that's just massively bulbous, giant long claws instead of fingernails, incredibly translucent skin, giant black eyes. Like, these are things that the Navigators could just be born with. But no matter what, they will gain these traits over time. The longer and longer they dive into the warp, the longer and longer they use their powers, they will actually mutate more and more. This is why Navigators are very specific and particular about their genetic coding and who they want reproducing versus who they don't want reproducing. If you were born as a Navigator and you already have like 5 mutations, but meanwhile, all the other Navigator children have like 2 or 3. They're going to look at you and say, listen, you're powerful, you're a Navigator through and through, but you started off with so many mutations as a child, it might be risky for you to be reproducing. So therefore, you're just going to serve your role as a Navigator, but do not reproduce. Because whatever children you're going to have is going to have a fuck ton of mutation to it. This also runs the risk where a lot of Navigators do end up becoming mutants. And by mutants, we're talking like uncategorized abhumans that are incredibly dangerous, usually mindless, and they're just terrifying beasts. As such, a lot of Navigators typically have that dread upon them, knowing that they could be reproducing, and instead of having a beautiful, amazing child who can bring great prosperity, they instead end up with a child who's just this malformed beast of bovine strength. So next, let's talk about power. What is exactly the power of Navigators themselves? Well, their power is far that of a Psyker. In fact, very few Psykers could ever hope to match a Navigator. So already the Navigator's power is ridiculous. The main reason why is because of their third eye, which is that genetic mutation. All Navigators have that third eye on their head. The interesting thing is that the power that they have is determined by how open that eye is. There are some Navigators where their eye is half open. They don't control this, by the way. It just gradually opens. And the big thing about the Navigator's eye is that it can change in a large variety of ways. Some Navigators are born where their eye is not really an eye, it's more like a giant black stone embedded in their forehead. That's totally fine. There's no difference in power. But for some reason, how open the eyelid is determines the strength of that eye. So a lot of times, some Navigators, they'll usually be born and the eye is completely closed. That's totally fine. As they mature, as they grow older, the eye starts to open. Starts as this little slit, not much. Then it starts to open up even more. Then it gets much more powerful. And hopefully, by the time they're around maybe like 30 years old, 40 years old, that eye is completely wide open. Now they're the true power of the warp. But if they're not, what happens then? What happens when that eye just doesn't want to open? There are actual cybernetic surgeries that they can conduct on themselves where they stick those eyelids completely wide open. And for some reason this works. You would think it's such a crude method of just doing some sort of shunt or shutter to force the eyelid open. And yet somehow biologically this works and allows it to access its ultimate power. Now the power itself, what kind of things it can do is pretty interesting. It allows the person who has the eye to see the warp at all times. Now a normal psyker can meditate and dive into the warp and see it that way, but they can't really constantly see it. They'll see hues, they'll see changes in the environment that other people probably won't, but a navigator, they don't have that option. They can't shut that eye. The eye never blinks. So even if their eyes are closed, that third eye is always open watching the warp, and it only sees the warp. As such, it's kind of pretty obvious, I would say, as to why navigators are usually partially insane. Because, I mean, imagine it. No matter what, you're constantly seeing the hues of the warp. The Imperium currently is in total disarray. Chaos is overflowing everywhere. Well, if I'm constantly seeing someone getting murdered, constant violent colors assaulting my brain constantly, I'd probably go insane too. Speaking about insanity, if you ever do see a navigator, don't ever stare in their eye. And it's not because it's rude. No, they don't give a fuck. The issue is that if you stare into their third eye, you are able to gaze into the warp through looking into that eye. And as such, it drives people insane. This is why a lot of times navigators wear hoods or some sort of amulet that blocks the eye. It's not because they like to. It's not for their protection. It's for you and me. Because if we stared into this third eye, which I mean, how would you not? It's such a glaring mutation. The moment you stare into it, you're running the risk of your mind being stripped of its defenses, and now you're staring butt naked into the warp, just gazing at the utter chaos and sheer terror that the warp controls. Now, interestingly enough, because I said earlier that the navigators can't really control this eye, it's just kind of forever opened, a lot of the navigators tend to refuse outright to go anywhere near the Eye of Terror. And it's understandable why. Because if you're constantly seeing the warp, the last thing you want to do is see the warp where it's strongest. See the warp where it is most dangerous, most potent, most chaotic. Because if they're constantly being assaulted in the mind, and you put them inside what's essentially a blender, no duh, it's going to scramble their brain. It's going to scramble them way too severely. It's going to hurt them more than you and I could ever fathom. So it's always been a general rule that if you're somewhere near the Eye of Terror, you're going to have to really suck up that navigator and really make sure that he likes you and is willing to endure such an adventure near that place. Now, as such, let's talk a bit about their perceptions. How do the common folk, how do the Mechanicus, how do the Space Marines, how do the Nobles, and how do the Inquisition in total kind of view the navigators? Well, with the common folk, they usually get very scared around navigators and they start to make up folk legends and ghost stories. Like, let's say, you know Bob. Bob is your 9-to-5 worker. He's with you for like 20 years. He's been your neighbor for a very long time. He's got a wife and 2 kids. Yeah, a little bit of domestic violence goes on there. You can always hear them yelling and stuff. One day, Bob is just screaming like crazy and you just think that he's getting into another fight with his wife and kids. But then all of a sudden you hear gunshots and you go over there and you see Bob has killed everybody. you as a commoner would say, oh my god, ever since that navigator came in, Bob is acting more and more crazy. Oh my god, Bob killed everyone. That navigator probably possessed his mind. That navigator who likes to hide away and make other people do his dirty work. That's the way people think. And that is the way people react to the navigators. Anytime a misfortune happens, anytime something terrible happens, they start attributing it to something otherworldly. And what's more otherworldly than a person who can gaze into the warp? A person who you can't even look at because they'll strip your soul of its defenses. These people tend to end up killing navigators and forming giant mobs to burn them at the stake. A lot of times the government, the imperium, get very pissed when this happens because they usually don't like that. These navigators are very rare and very hard to find, and here you are killing them. And they're so important to the imperium as a whole that as far as the imperium is concerned, they say, hey, I don't give a shit if the rumors are true. If you actually did make Bob kill his kids and shit, fuck them, okay? Do whatever you do, boo. Just guide our ships, please. That's the way the imperium views us. Now, what about the Mechanicus? Now, the Mechanicus gets very interesting. Let me take a swig of this water. Ah, delicious. The Mechanicus is very interesting because the Mechanicus is purely objective with the way they view things. Very logical people. And here they are using people that are completely the opposite. These people are completely subjective. They're not about logic. They're about interpretation. They're about soul and artistry. This is something Mechanicus just doesn't engage in. So it's very interesting is that the Mechanicus treats the navigators with really great respect. And they actually do treat them very fairly. More fairly than sometimes the Imperium. And you may say, well, that's kind of odd. Usually the Mechanicus usually experiments on everybody, treats everybody like shit, doesn't really care, dismisses everybody. They don't care about Space Marines. They don't care about the Inquisition. They always wave their hand and proudly tot around about how they're better than everybody. But yet the Navigators, they do not do that. And the reason why is because the Mechanicus understands very clearly their ships do not work without the Mechanicus and the Navigators working together. So, as such, the Mechanicus treats them utterly respectably, and they don't understand the Navigators. They don't understand the slightest fucking bit. But they just simply say, you do you, boo. I'm gonna stay over here and keep the ship together. You just get my ship to where it needs to be. Because after all, you have to think about the history. The Mechanicus literally had an empire across the stars and then lost that entire empire because they couldn't get their ships into those planets because of warp storms and a few other calamities. And here they have engines now that can actually drive, but they need someone who's psychically gifted to steer it. This is why the Mechanicus is like, listen, usually we stick our noses up and we pretend like we're better than everyone, but with the Navigators, put that shit the fuck away. Treat them with respect, because we need them, or else we're going to lose our empire again. Now, when it comes to Space Marines and Navigators, it depends really, cannot stress this, it depends a lot on the chapter. Black Templars do not like them. And as much as they hate it, they will openly talk about killing the Navigator to their face. They will openly talk about how they cannot trust the Navigator. They'll talk about how they're not a human to their face. But they do make deals and promises with the Navigators that if they ever did wipe out all the Xenos, all the heretics, all the abhumans, the Navigators would be the last ones. And upon which the Navigators are just like, whatever. If you ever take a contract with the Black Templars, just fucking stay in your goddamn chambers. Don't ever talk to them. They're assholes. Same with like a few other Space Marine chapters, like my boys, the Marines Malevolent, Black and Yellow. They pretty much probably kidnap the Navigators, if not steal them outright. So the Navigators don't really like them too much. But then you have others like the Ultramarines, the Salamanders. They treat them like decent citizens. They even treat them like nobility because they are technically nobles. And as such, navigators have no issues working with them. In fact, some of them find it prestigious to work for those specific groups. Next is the nobles. So the nobility of Terra, they view the navigators kind of like tools in a sense. For instance, in a lot of novels, a lot of rich nobles will employ the services of navigators and just simply have them around for their own musing. They find it funny, they find it interesting, and they also find it as like a status symbol to say, I have a navigator at my beck and call. A lot of times though, nobles are very foolish in Warhammer 40k, and the very few nobles who are not foolish know very well the power of a navigator, and they still would rather have one in one of their retinues just in case they need something. Like, what if they need to send a message? What if they need to immediately evacuate a planet? These are things that these nobles usually keep them around for. At the same time, a lot of times these nobles will ignore or slightly mistreat their navigators, treating them as just common muck, just abhumans that, again, this kind of depends on what kind of noble we're talking about. If we're talking about like a planetary governor, he may even try to sexually assault such a navigator if they're handsome or beautiful enough, like our blubberous gentleman is on this photo. But other times they're just simply going to muse at them and just insult them casually to their face about how, they can't enjoy the finer things in life and how weird it is that they see through a third eye and stuff like that. Very few nobles actually understand that sometimes these navigators are actually richer than they are and much more powerful than they are. And the few times that a navigator puts a noble in their place is usually when the navigator just says, you know what, I'm just going to leave. I'm just going to go somewhere else. And that's when the noble starts crawling on their feet, begging for the navigator to stay. Lastly, the Inquisition. The Inquisition are very cautious with navigators. Interestingly enough, the Inquisition tries not to entangle in navigator issues, even though, as I said earlier, navigator genes are very unstable, and they have a high risk of becoming mutants. Inquisitors do want to know that, but every time that they see something like that happen, they just hope to the God Emperor, they're like, please don't make me actually have to do this. I don't want to get involved. And the reason why is because navigators are so powerful and they have their own houses, their own nobility, that the Inquisition is always on their friendly side. Because again, just like the Mechanicus, without them they can't get their ships anywhere. So the Inquisition usually, whenever they investigate the navigators, they usually try to do it on the side of caution. And unlike the Mechanicus, they actually will give up if the navigators say, hey, we're going to handle this ourselves. Butt out of it, outsider. The Inquisition usually will back down and say, okay, because I didn't want to get involved in the first place. These guys are dangerous as hell, and also the power that they have over us is a lot, and how few there are, we really can't be exterminatusing these people. If they're ever going to exterminatus a planet, the first thing they're concerned is there any navigators on here? And if so, are they tainted with chaos? If not, get their asses out of there. They're going to be the only people they evacuate. Fuck the planetary governor. Blow up the whole goddamn planet. Just get those people out of there. So that way we maintain friendly relations. So, the noble houses. There's a few. There's the winners, the losers, the beggars, and the damned. The winners are those who still lay claim that they are the oldest family, dating way before the Imperium of Man. And there is some evidence to show that navigators did exist even in the age of technology, which is a very long time ago. We're talking like Warhammer 20k. Like, damn, they've been around for a long time. These houses usually reside in Terra, in the Navigator district. And I'm not joking, they actually have their own district. These ones are extremely powerful and extremely rich. We're talking like they own dozens of planets. They have dozens of troops at their disposal, along with, usually, they have someone on the seats of the High Lords of Terra, the Prima Nova, as they call them. Then we have the losers. The losers are usually the noble houses that they're not losers per se. They're sometimes called beggar houses. Sometimes they're called just simply low-life navigators or lesser breed. But usually these are navigators who either they had no choice due to being outswindled by the other noble houses, or they had better holdings or better control in a certain sector, so they just chose to leave Terra. Again, these people, I'm calling them the losers. They're really not, though. They're actually very important to the Imperium, arguably more so than the winners are, which is just the regular noble houses. Because you see, these beggar houses, these nobles, they may have a strong power base in a certain sector. They may say, you know what, we have a very good thing going. Of the 500 worlds that Robert Gilliman conquered, we personally own like 30 of them. We would really rather live closer to our power base rather than live on Terra far away from our power base. So they'll do so. And this is usually an Imperial commander's wet dream, because if they're ever in a battle and they lose their navigator in any way, shape, or form, they know that there's always a local enclave that they can go to that is more than willing to accept a position on their ship. Whereas if they're one of the Terra nobility, they may have space station outposts, they may have an enclave somewhere on someone's planet, but because of their Terra relations, they're so prestigious and so poised that they may refuse an Imperial commander and say, listen, I have other ships to use, and these ships have better relations with us back home on Terra. So your ship's just going to have to stay docked for a few decades, okay? We don't care about the war that's happening 2 solar systems over. We're more focused on our allies, our true allies, Commander, and you haven't helped us yet. So, get fucked. Then we have the beggars. The beggars are usually the ones that actually do reside on the ships themselves. These are usually navigators who don't have any territory. They don't have any homes. And this could be due to a few number of reasons. They could have just been the less fortunate navigators. In other words, they could have been the navigators where the Emperor claimed the entire galaxy, and then finally these guys showed up on like the fringes of the galaxy. And they're like, hey, we're navigators too. Yeah, you're navigators, but you didn't help us at all, so you ain't getting shit of this pie. You're not getting a single piece, buddy boy. And then they just have to stay in the fringes. Some of these, though, have really, really bad histories. After all, you have to think of the Horus Heresy. How did Horus deploy a good half of the Imperial army without also having half of the navigators at his disposal? Some of these beggar houses and some of these beggars can actually be this case. Sometimes they're called shrouded houses. And personally, to me, I kind of like the idea of beggars because a shrouded house really is that. The shrouded house would actually be the ones who are more or less begging any commander who comes by to take one of their numbers. They're more nomadic. They usually don't own any titles or any planets like the beggar houses usually do, or the lower houses. But the shroud houses, which would be these that I keep calling the beggars, I know, it's confusing. I love it. But these guys, they usually have a bad history and they're trying to reclaim glory. They're trying to prove to the Imperium, like, hey, we're cool, we're awesome. Please give us jobs so that way we can have a power base to grow and eventually own one of our own vessels, our own ships, our own space station. As such, these guys usually live in the ships that they're assigned to, which is very odd for navigators, obviously. Lastly, we have the damned. These are your chaos boys. Now, not necessarily chaos. Some of the damned, they really don't care if they serve chaos or not. They just don't restrict themselves. So in other words, if they breed a child and the child has 8 mutations, they don't care. As long as the mutations don't kill the child, and as long as the child is still a navigator and still powerful as hell, they're happy. They're like, oh yeah, that's awesome. As such, the damned are usually viewed as heretical and usually are killed by inquisitors more often than not. And one of the interesting things about the damned is that the damned are usually not strictly attacked on sight. As I said, some of them are just simply, they'll do whatever it takes to become more powerful. Some of them will do whatever it takes to overthrow other navigators. They don't care. As long as it's power, they do not care. If one of the damned houses is hired and they help guide your ship, they may end up with a position where they say, ooh, I could actually commandeer this vessel and bring it back to my nobility house. Now we have a ship at our disposal. They will absolutely do it. They're very power hungry, and they're very selfish, and they're very obsessed with nothing but power. As such, usually people just kill them on sight. So next, let's talk about their culture. So the culture of the nobility, especially those who are on Terra, they have a lot of customs, and they live rather lavishly. We're talking like rooms decorated in gold, statues of every single person, a painting of every single guy, the best artisans you can ever imagine. They live richer than the ecclesiarchy sometimes. As such, you can imagine that a lot of these nobilities, they're very, I want to say elitist sometimes. In some books, they're very elitist, where they just simply look at someone and go, you'll never see the beauty that I see with my eye. You'll never understand the amazing magnitude of this painting or sculpture that you and I both are looking at, because I'm seeing it from my third eye. So it's kind of a bit of an elitist mindset, and they do have their very staunch traditions, and I mean very staunch traditions. Like if you insult their honor, or if they just want to knock your noble house a peg or two, they'll challenge each other into duels, and when these duels happen, what they do is they just blast each other with their eye, and whoever kneels first loses. It's never to the death. But once that happens, they'll have a huge feast, a huge banquet, and they have to be attending if they're the losers, because these nobility, they like to rub it in each other's faces that, hey, you lost, hey, you're not as powerful as we are. Yeah, just because there's a few of them, and just because they're a minority who's constantly kind of like dealt with a bit of persecution and shit, doesn't mean that they're not assholes to each other. They definitely are. A lot of times the navigator will hate other navigators more than people hate navigators. They're also very focused on their breeding. To a navigator, they're raised in a very tight-knit society. And it makes sense. If your genetics are very recessive, if it's very difficult to breed such a strong navigator, and the very power of your lifestyle, the very nobility of your bloodline relies on you being pure, a lot of times these people will subject themselves to genetic tampering, genetic testing, and they will forego their emotions and say, listen, if I've got to marry this person just because it breeds good relations between my house and their house, and it also makes a very good genetic pure child, I will do it. I may hate this person to my core, but if it's for the betterment of my family, for the betterment of my house, for the betterment of my society, I will do it. And then when it comes to certain sciences like genetics, they actually do employ their own geneticists. And it's something that the Mechanicus is not allowed to even touch, because you have to remember, the Mechanicus is not allowed to research psychers in any way, shape, or form. And it's very interesting because there's a few places we can look at in the Imperium where they do actually have their own scientists, and the Mechanicus, for once, is not the monopoly of technology. That would be here, and also with the Golden Throne, the Imperial Palace. We see that in these areas, they have their own scientists who have no relation to the Mechanicus on Mars, and they are doing their own studies, their own science work. And the Mechanicus is completely left aloof because the Mechanicus is not allowed to operate in these fields. As such, it's not uncommon for you to see a navigator with a bunch of test tubes in their labs, a bunch of possibly even fetuses floating inside these tubes because they're testing the genetic strength and trying to see if they can possibly replicate it when the time comes for so-and-so to breed. As such, their society is also very isolated, hence why I put isolation here. A lot of times, due to the persecution, the perceptions, and also just the raw power, nobility, arrogance that a navigator has, they usually prefer to be by themselves. A lot of times, when you think about it, if someone's into art, if someone's into sculpting, if someone's into all this beautiful stuff, they're into reading classic literature, do you think they're going to get along well with the common muck who just keep talking about things like, oh, did you see the latest gun that arrived? Oh, yeah, man, it's got this cool power wattage. What? Nah, the Mark V had a better... Like, they're going to say, all right, this conversation's not my cup of tea. You're all a bunch of degenerates. You're a bunch of low-life Neanderthals. I'm going to go back to my studies. And that's pretty much the way these guys live. In fact, the most exposure they have to normal humans is usually these servants that they have. And they don't do servitors. They don't. They don't like to use servitors if they can help it. They usually prefer real people because then they enjoy looking at through their eye and seeing their hues, their colors, their attitudes, their very mannerisms. And it's a much more pleasing environment for them. Mind you, these people are so psychically gifted and they are kind of insane, so it's always customary for them to be extremely, extremely pampered. You like this servant because you just like someone with long hair? Be my guest, take them, teach them everything about your antics, your everything. Basically, they have an emotional support human at all times. Next, we have power gaining. In Navigator society, they're always focused on their power. And it's not just their noble house power, it's also their own personal power. It's very interesting to know is that each nobility house has like their own magics, sort of say. And that's what makes the Navigators so interesting. Psychers usually draw upon similar spells, similar magics. We see with Space Marines that all their Psychers or librarians pretty much all have the same spells. But the Navigators is not like that at all. Navigators are much like the Warp. They have millions of different flavors, millions of different spells that they use at their disposal. As such, it kind of comes with their power gaining strategy where sometimes they try to invent new magics, new spells that they can do. There's one like I have on the image here where this Navigator is blinding and sucking the eyes out of every orc around her so no one can hurt her. That's a crazy spell, and that's unique to her. That might not even be her house that can do that. It's stuff like that I find very interesting about the nobilities and the Navigators themselves, is that you may see a house, and you may say, oh, I know this house. These Navigators have it where in their house, and only their house, no other Navigator does this, they can turn everybody into stone if they so choose to. And that is just fascinating. It's like, what do you mean? How is it only them that knows how to do it? Again, they're working from a purely subjective reality than you or I. To them, the warp is really their muse. They can make it do whatever they want in reality, in the immaterium, to the materium. But to you and me, we're just baffled. It's like someone using the same gun as me. What do you mean the bullet comes out sideways out of the barrel? How the hell did you do that? How'd you make the bullet curve around the target? That shouldn't be possible. That's defying the reality. I thought we're all using the same gun here, but apparently yours can do all sorts of shit, Jackie Chan style. That's the exact point I'm illustrating here with the Navigators. Compared to Psychers, they are way different, way better in a lot of ways, and way more powerful and more dangerous. So besides that, this has been Freezer 700. I am out. I hope you guys enjoyed my ranting, but honestly, I find the Navigators a very unique topic, because here we're seeing the extremes, which is, what can the ultimate psyker dream be? Is it to be a navigator in the end of their life? To end up somehow marrying someone, and it turns out they both have the navigator recessive gene, and they somehow have a child, in that 25% chance, yeah, that's right, I got my Punnett square here, that 25% chance that that child actually does come out as a navigator. Now they just jump for joy and say, yes, we can now have access to a noble house. That could be an interesting story. That could be an interesting exploration of an idea of someone who's like, oh, I've fallen from grace because my mother, she was dumb as fuck. She decided to marry some random rogue trader, have a child, and that's me. And now I have the navigator gene, but I can never be a navigator, and I'm shunned from their society, and I wish to join them because my mom says great things about them. And then here it is, you find a girl who's another story just like you, and you go, wait a minute, there's a 25% chance for us to have a kid that actually is a navigator. This could be our ticket. So besides that, has been Freezer 700. I am out. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, see you guys next time. Peace.